consistent so that more flowers and pods will bore during the next raining season. When participating in a UTZ certified program, farmers will need to take note of the following. 1. Don't irrigate cocoa with water from polluted water sources. 2. Avoid wasteful irrigation to preserve the underground reservoir and prevent erosion of nutrient. Through field testing in Vietnam, we can estimate that in the first year, the amount of fertilizer needed for each tree is about 150 to 200 grams of NPK fertilizer per year. In the second year, the amount of fertilizer needed is increased to 300 to 400 grams per tree, and in the third year, 500 to 600 grams per tree. From the fourth year onwards, the cocoa tree goes into full production stage. The purpose of fertilizing in this stage is to maintain the tree's growth and replenish the nutrients it needs to create pods and beans. Depending on the conditions of the local land and the cocoa yield, that we balance out the necessary amount of fertilizer needed for the trees. The principle of fertilizing for cocoa during production stage is based on the amount of nutrients that a tree took to create pods and nutrients lost due to environmental interference. Each type of nutrients has different effects. To avoid imbalanced fertilizing, when fertilizing cocoa, we need to know well the effects of each one to help the trees grow and develop better. First, organic fertilizers have the ability to rehabilitate the soil, increasing aeration and nutrient content. Second, it will create an environment for beneficial microorganisms to grow. Third, organic fertilizers will assist in the breaking down and consumption rate of synthesized fertilizer. Furthermore, organic fertilizers will help the cocoa trees develop healthily with thick and green leaves, reduce pests and diseases, increase flower and pod bearing rates. The pods will be shinier, larger, and increase quality. Urea or nitrogen fertilizers help trees increase their body mass. It helps the trunk, branches, and leaves of the tree grow faster, larger, as well as the pods. On the current market, there are two types of phosphates, rock phosphate and superphosphate. In alkaline soil, it is recommended that rock phosphate be used. Phosphate fertilizers encourage root expansion as well as flower and pod bearing in cocoa trees. As for potassium fertilizers, it assists in the mechanism of the stomata in cocoa leaves, increasing photosynthesis activities. Potassium strengthens the tree, making it more resistant to pests and diseases. Potassium also helps the cocoa tree accumulate sugar and carbohydrates, making the pods and beans larger and firmer. We should also apply lime annually in the plantation. Lime can supplement calcium in the trees as well as reduce acidity level in the soil. Lime can also help eliminate a number of pests and diseases in the cocoa plantation. Cocoa farmers should also spray micronutrient foliage fertilizers 2 to 4 times a year. Micronutrient fertilizer helps cocoa resist pests and diseases, as well as increase the rate of flower and pod bearing. For cocoa to consume fertilizer efficiently, cocoa farmers need to understand the flow of fertilizer through the tree. Fertilizer enters the soil. Root hairs take in the fertilizer and transport it to the leaves through vascular bundles. When met with favorable conditions like sunlight, water, and air, photosynthesis will occur and compound organic matter will be produced. From there, the beneficial compound organic matter will be taken to feed different parts of the tree. Therefore, from the very day it is planted until production stage, the cocoa tree will always need plenty of leaves and receive sunlight for photosynthesis. That way, fertilizer can be used most efficiently. Amount and type of fertilizer for the production stage. With the expectation of yielding around 25 kilograms of pods per tree per year, we will need a specific amount of fertilizer of 2 kilograms per tree per year of the following formula: 400 grams of urea, 800 grams of phosphate, and 800 grams of potassium chloride. If NPK fertilizer is used, we need to use the following formula: 13-11-21 or 12-12-17, or other fertilizers with high potassium content. This is also applied about 2 kilograms per tree per year. For compost organic fertilizer, we need to apply 5 to 10 kilograms per tree per year, or 2 to 3 kilograms of biofertilizer. Lime needs to be applied 300 grams per tree per year. Micronutrients need to be sprayed 2 to 4 times per year. Application method. When applying fertilizer for cocoa, coverage is required to avoid fertilizer evaporation. For organic fertilizers, we need to dig trenches and isolate the root system. Pour in the fertilizer, mix with dirt and cover with a thin layer of soil or leaves on top. For protein, potassium, phosphate or NPK, we need to dig trenches or rake the layer of leaves aside, spread the fertilizer, and then cover it back up. When applying fertilizer, the soil condition must be at the appropriate moisture level. If it is too dry, we must irrigate immediately for the fertilizer to dissolve. Lime, in particular, needs to be applied once a year at the beginning of the raining season and spread evenly on the surface of the plantation. Foliar fertilizer needs to be sprayed in cloudy and cool weather condition and sprayed on the underside of the leaves. Cocoa has a totally different mechanism of flower and pod bearing compared to most fruit crops, which only bloom flowers and bear fruits once a year. On an optimally cultivated cocoa tree, there should be a complete collection of flowers, newly formed pods, growing pods, ripe pods, and old pods. Therefore, fertilizer application method for cocoa must also be totally different from other crops. It is best if the amount of fertilizers in a year applied for cocoa be spread out as much as possible. Time of application will depend on the development condition of the cocoa tree. For organic fertilizer, lime and phosphate, they need to be applied at the beginning of the raining season, around end of April and the beginning of May. Times of application. During the establishment stage, the amount of complex fertilizer applied is divided evenly between 6 to 8 times in a year. During this stage, the tree is still small, the roots are still few, and we apply fertilizer many times to make it easier to consume and process. When cocoa goes into production stage, urea and potassium are divided into 6 application periods and applied at the markers of after production pruning to encourage flowering and pod bearing at the times of pod growing, around January, March, May, July, September, and November of each year. Furthermore, during these periods, foliar fertilizer needs to be sprayed to supplement all the necessary nutrients for the tree to develop sufficiently and bear pods better. Methods of maximizing fertilizer efficiently. In order to get the most benefit when applying fertilizer, we need to uniformly apply caretaking techniques like appropriate shade management and correct pruning. Apply a balanced and adequate amount of fertilizer. Apply fertilizer in the appropriate humidity, and the fertilizers get covered by dirt or leaves. There should be no wild weeds competing for nutrients. Irrigation in conjunction with fertilizer works the best. When participating in a UTZ certified program, farmers will need to take note of the following. 1. Fertilizer must be applied in a balanced amount and reasonable manner. 2. Increase the amount of organic fertilizer used. 3. Apply fertilizer based on the needs of the tree, the state of the soil based on the age and productivity of the trees. 4. Unused fertilizer must be stored in a cool, dry place with cover. Do not store fertilizer in the same place as cocoa beans or other produce. 5. Fertilizer application equipment must be cleaned and stored properly after use. 6. Keep notes of fertilizer application. Shade adjustment. When cocoa is fully grown, the leaves start to weave into each other. We need to prune thin the shade trees. Most temporary shade trees are cut down around the second year. For permanent shade trees, we should keep 70 to 120 trees per hectare, depending on the type of trees. We should not eliminate the shades too abruptly, which will affect the development of the cocoa trees. We can gradually reduce the shades by pruning the branches, then slowly cutting down some shade trees. In places that are well covered by windbreakers or the wind is not strong, when the cocoa leaves have touching canopies, we can opt to not have shade trees but must supply enough water and fertilizer to prevent the trees from aging and deteriorating too fast. However, to maintain a balanced ecology in the plantation, reduce wind speed, and avoid injuries to young leaves, we should keep shading at around 25%. The purpose of pruning is 1. Easy of passage when caretaking and harvesting. 2. The plantation gets better ventilation, making it easier to prevent and reduce pests and diseases. 3. Help trees have more leaves that receive more sunlight to photosynthesize better. 4. Balance out the architecture. Avoid leaning and falling. 5. Reduce nutrient competition. 6. Increase flower and pod bearing rate and stabilize yield. The principle of pruning is to leave a good amount of leaves on the tree that will receive a good amount of sunlight. Beside that, we must prune to adjust the tree's growth. The branches reach out to every direction to receive as much sunlight as possible. The canopy must take up the space allotted for each tree. The underside of the canopy must be clear. The height of the tree must be appropriate for caretaking and pest and diseases control. Notice, prune gradually. Don't prune too much in one session. Branches should be pruned at the beginning of the raining season and 2 months before the rain ends. To make it convenient for pruning, farmers must have appropriate equipment like small pruning shears, long-range pruners, and handsaw. Pruning during the establishment stage must start right when planting and must be practiced regularly. Cocoa trees are usually pruned as early as right after planting. For cocoa during the establishment stage, we practice the following pruning techniques. For cocoa in their first year, we prune the branches near the bottom of the base. We will also prune the branches splitting out of the lower sections of the trunk. For branches that grow too tall, we will prune them to suppress vertical growth and encourage lateral growth. In plantations where cocoa are intercropped with other crops, they tend to lean and fall. We can use a straight bamboo stick to stabilize the young cocoa like this. When properly cultivated, a healthy first-year cocoa tree should look like the one shown here. When the bottom and lower branches are pruned, the top is cut off and the trunk is stabilized. The cocoa tree will have a full and round canopy. As we can see here, most of the leaves have contact with sunlight. This tree here would be regarded as a very well developed for a first-year cocoa tree. During the second year, some cocoa trees will have canopies growing unevenly. Therefore, we must prioritize pruning the outstanding growing branches so that the canopy will develop well into an evenly round shape. After pruning the tall top branches, the lower branches can now grow to the same height as the higher branches. This is a cocoa tree entering its third year. As we can see here, a third-year cocoa tree has many types of growing branches, such as low-hanging branches near the bottom, outstanding growing branches at the top, and many branches in the midsection that cannot receive sufficient sunlight. Therefore, we will prioritize pruning these branches. However, please note that due to the amount of branches that we will have to prune at one time, we should only prune the trees when they have sufficient water. When pruning, we make our best effort to leave as much leaves on a tree as possible. If small and hidden branches inside the canopy are receiving sunlight, we should leave them on the tree. For cocoa plantations approaching production stage, they will have many low-hanging or weaving branches that can greatly affect accessibility of the plantation's caretaking. That is why during this stage, we must prune low-hanging and weaving branches. Through that, we will define the shape of the cocoa tree as it enters the production stage. We should only leave about 3 to 5 main branches on the cocoa tree, spread evenly in all directions, which will create a reasonable canopy frame for the cocoa tree. If we practice good pruning techniques during the establishment stage, we will not encounter situations like this cocoa tree. Here, the cocoa tree is not pruned during establishment stage, which is why the tree has many crawling branches, drooping branches, and especially a leaning canopy. To remedy the situation, many technical steps must be taken to give cocoa tree a healthier, better-looking canopy. For cocoa plantations that have unpruned, unkempt canopies during production stage, such as this, we will proceed with the following techniques. First step to rehabilitate the canopies is to assess the state of the plantation and the trees. For plantations that are lacking shade trees, we must make steps to grow and provide more shade trees for the plantation. For cocoa plantations that are intercropped with other crops such as coconuts, cashews, or other crops, we must consider modifying the shade trees before modifying the cocoa trees. This is because after pruning the shade trees, we can register adequately the amount of sunlight in the plantation to prune the cocoa trees. Next, we walk around a plantation to look for and prune branches that are overlapping with neighboring canopies. For example, this branch is encroaching to another tree that we want to prune, so we will prune it first. After pruning overlapping branches, the branches that we want to prune will be revealed in the empty spaces around the cocoa tree. This cocoa tree has a crooked, leaning canopy. We will need to use a stick or ropes to restore it to its original position. The purpose of propping up this branch is so that the tree will recover its canopies with lots of leaves, increasing its yield for the next season. Here, we have some low-hanging branches, basically crawling on the ground, making it very inconvenient for plantations' access and caretaking. Furthermore, during the raining season, wet soil will splash onto the branches easily, spreading black pod disease. That is why we will have to cut off all the low